and be able to hug them. I appreciate so many cards that the young ones are sending me. They really do encourage me. They make me smile, and I really do love the fact that you like these studies. And I want you to know I love every one of you so very much, and I mean that sincerely. Jody and I just dearly love every one of you, and we'll include the adults in that too. Last week, Jordan did an excellent job talking about Moses and Joshua. He did an excellent job laying out how God had been preparing Joshua from the earliest moments to be the next leader. Turn with me to Deuteronomy chapter 34 real quickly. And I want to begin there reading tonight. It says, verse 1, Then Moses went up from the plains of Moab to Mount Nebo, to the top of Pisgah, which is across from Jericho. And the Lord showed him all the land of Gilead as far as Dan, all Naphtali and the land of Ephraim, and Manasseh, all the land of Judah, as far as the western sea, the south, and the plain of the valley of Jericho, and the city of the palm trees, as far as Zor. And the Lord said to him, This is the land which I swore to give Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, saying, I will give it to your descendants. I have caused you to sit with your eyes, but you shall not cross over. So Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in the land of Moab, according to the word of the Lord. And he buried him in a valley in the land of Moab, opposite Beth Peor, but no one knows where his grave is to this day. Moses was 120 years old when he died. His eyes were not dim, nor his natural vigor diminished. And the children of Israel wept for Moses in the plains of Moab 30 days. The days of weeping and mourning for Moses ended. Now Joshua, the son of Nun, was full of the spirit of wisdom, for Moses had laid his hands on him, so the children of Israel heeded him, and did as the Lord had commanded Moses. But since there has not arisen in Israel a prophet like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face, in all the signs and the wonders which the Lord had sent him to do in the land of Egypt, before Pharaoh, all his servants, and in all his land, and by all that mighty power and all that great terror which Moses performed in the sight of all Israel. This chapter kind of bleeds over or flows into what out of what Jordan talked about last week. Jordan, as I said, did an excellent job laying out the case for Joshua being the next leader, and how, as I said a moment ago, from the earliest moments, Moses has taken Joshua next to him, and every step of the way, Moses has been preparing Joshua. And now Moses has died. And it says that Israel wept, and they mourned for 30 days. That had to be so hard for them. I don't know that I can imagine how difficult it would have been for the children of Israel and Joshua to have lost Moses. It had to be a really grave loss, a sad loss for them. But God has provided leadership to continue with Joshua. His legacy, God's legacy of Moses through Joshua, will continue. Here Moses was the older man, Joshua the younger man. At this point in time, Joshua is probably around 80 years old. That would not seem too young to us, but Moses died at 120. So Moses is 40 years older than Joshua. That's still quite a window of time, regardless of whether you're 80 or whether you're 40. And so now then, Joshua is ready to go. Moses has turned everything over to him, ready to lead. And so we come to Joshua chapter 1. After the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord, it came to pass that the Lord spoke to Joshua the son of Nun, Moses' assistant, saying, Moses, my servant, is dead. Now therefore rise, go over this Jordan, you and all this people to the land which I'm giving to them, the children of Israel. That's a really important statement. The land which I'm giving to the children of Israel. Do you remember in Deuteronomy chapter 34 and verse 4? It said, the Lord said to him, This is the land which I swore to give Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, saying, I will give it to your descendants. I've caused you to sit with your eyes, but you shall not cross over. This is the land God promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Israel's been in bondage 430 years. Now they've been walking in the wilderness for 40 years. So 470 years at least, there was a period of time between the death of Abraham and the time they were in bondage. There were several years that passed then. So well over 500 years ago, God had given this promise to Abraham. And now Joshua is going to fulfill that promise by leading the children of Israel over into the promised land. This was a mighty task. Joshua himself realized he was not up for it. I mean, just think about it. The children of Israel have been wandering in the wilderness for 40 years. And now they're going to go fight a war? Now they're going to go into the promised land and they're going to begin to fight people to get them out of the land, to drive them out of the land? They're not a fighting kind of people. They're not good at wars. All the people in the land of Canaan would have been well equipped for war. The children of Israel would not have been. And so Joshua realizes that. But here's something really important that happens. The first generation that failed, all now but Joshua and Caleb have died. And now then the second generation is going to get a second chance. They're going to get a second chance to do what their fathers and their mothers and their grandfathers and their grandmothers could not do. You know, in a way, that had to be a time in which they had to be real happy about that. And yet again, it had to be a time in which they were really kind of sad because they get to see something their parents never got to see. But you know, it's often that way. If you take Moses and Joshua, as Jordan spoke last week, we're always building for the next generation. As older people, we're building for you younger people now. And the time will come, as Jordan and I have spoken about, in which you will become the older people and you'll be beginning to build for the younger people. That means everybody's important. And Joshua's important now, but all these young people now are important that have been in this second generation about to go over the land. And so God has a piece of encouragement to Joshua. Look at verse 6. Be strong and be of good courage. For this people you shall divide as an inheritance the land which I swore to your fathers. Look again at verse 7. Be strong and very courageous, that you may observe to do all according to the law, which Moses my servant commanded you. And then look at verse 9. Have I not commanded you, be strong and of good courage? Do not be afraid, Lord is made. For the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. God's trying to really build Joshua up. God's trying to help Joshua get ready for taking the land. Something interesting about the land. The land was approximately 300 square miles, the land of Canaan. But God said, wherever you put your foot, I'm going to give you the land. Look at what he will say. Verse 3, every place the sole of your foot will tread, I have given you as I said to Moses. Every place you put your foot, I will give you the land. Now, there's 300 square miles that make up the land of Canaan. Boy, that's big. That gets over. I don't understand 300 square miles. But the children of Israel only touched 30,000 square miles. A third. Well, I tried to find a way to illustrate that for you. And so, I didn't say this when I began. I got ahead of myself here. I apologize. Let me rewind the tape here. Get your paper. I hope you have your paper. I hope you have your pencils or your pen or something to write with. Get your paper ready. Hope you had that ready as we go. And so, what I want you to do, I got my graphics department active again. And so Miss Jody, my graphics specialist, I asked her to draw me a pie and divide it in thirds. And so, if you look at that pie and you divide it into thirds and you color in the bottom part, that bottom part of that pie is the only part that Israel possessed. This was the only part they possessed. All of this was left empty. All that was left untouched until the time of Solomon, David and Solomon. Then they began to spread the land and they began to conquer more of the land. but they only got a third of what God had promised them. That's really kind of sad that they didn't touch all the land. Now, if you turn that page over, or if you get a second page, this is what I want you to do. And I'm not hiding anything tonight. Everything's open tonight. Stay with me. Don't get ahead of me. I first want you to draw, say, Joshua chapter 1. And I want you to draw a picture of Joshua. And underneath the picture of Joshua, I want you to write courage. Now, I want you to notice my picture of Joshua. He's been on a diet. Joshua's been on a diet while he's been waiting for all this to take place. Joshua hasn't muscled up yet. That's why God is telling him to be strong and be of good courage. Joshua needs to get some meat on his bones. So my graphics department helped us see that Joshua was a man of war. You see that sword in his hand? And God is telling him to be courageous. God's telling him to be courageous as he goes out to conquer the land. There's a couple of things I think that are important for us to see as we start this. In Joshua chapter 1, verses 1 through 2, live in the present, not in the past. Think about this. The presence of Moses loomed large over Joshua. The shadow of Moses cast a wide swath or distance over Joshua. Moses was great. Moses was a tremendous leader, and he was beloved by these people. And his shadow was really wide and big. And now here comes Joshua. Do you think Joshua was just a little intimidated by that? He's got to take over for Moses. Who can take over for Moses? There's not been one like him. And yet God tells Joshua to do it. What that tells us is, as we saw in verse 6, verse 7, and verse 9, is God is telling us we have to live in the present. We can't live in the past. Maybe the children of Israel would have kept longing for Moses to be with them, longing for Moses to be with them. And I'm sure there are moments that Joshua, when he's leading these children of Israel, I'm sure there are moments in which he thought, man, I sure wish Moses was here. But now then, Joshua has to step outside the shadow of Moses and live in the present, not the past. That's so important for us. Now, we're going to talk about the past in just a moment when we get to chapter 4. But here at least, it was important for Joshua to go forward in the battle. And what that meant was he had to recognize the presence of God in his circumstances. God came to them at some of the darkest times in their life. And now God has provided for 40 years with Moses' leadership. And he says, now, Joshua, I'm going to provide now for you like I did for Moses. God's presence always makes a difference in helping us. That's what I want us to understand. Whether we're young or whether we're old, God's presence always is there to help us sometimes in our darkest moments, our most lonely times. God's presence is always there. What I want my young ones to realize is God's presence is with us. Oh yeah, we can't touch him, we can't taste him, we'd like to put our hands on him, but what I mean is God's influence, God's care, God's provisions, God is there for us every step of the way. And that's important in our lives, whether we're young or old, realize. And then what we realize is they had to rely fully on God's commands. Look at what it says in verse 6 and verse 7. Verse 7, only be strong and very courageous, that you may observe to do according to all the law which Moses, my servant, commanded you. Don't turn from the right or left, that you may prosper wherever you go. This book of the law shall not depart from your mouth, but you shall meditate on it day and night, that you may observe to do according to all that is written. They were still going to have to keep God's commands. This wasn't going to be, okay, they could do what they want to do. They still have to keep God's commands. Well, we come to chapter 2. And, okay, on our paper, we now want chapter 2 of Joshua, and we've got to draw a window. And then we have to have Rahab and the spies. So Joshua chapter 2, we have our window, Rahab and the spies. We got Joshua with courage, but now then Joshua's got a problem. He got to send some guys into Canaan to see what it's like. That's interesting. Because 40 years before, Joshua had been one of the 12. that had gone on a covert, a behind the scenes, a secret mission into Canaan to spy out the land. And you remember what they said about those people? They're huge. We're tiny grasshoppers in their sight. Those guys are giants. There's no way we can take them. Hey, they haven't shrunk. 40 years later, they're still the same giants. But Joshua's got to know some things. So he chooses 2 spies to go into the land of Canaan. And they go into the land of Canaan and they find a place to stay. And it's in the house of a lady named Rahab. Look at what Rahab will say, beginning in Joshua 2 and verse 1. Now Joshua the son of Nun sent out 2 men from Acacia Grove to spy secretly, saying, go view the land, especially Jericho. So they went and came to the house of a harlot named Rahab, and they lodged there. And so it was told the king of Jericho, saying, behold, men have come here tonight from the children of Israel to search out the country. He said, go to Rahab, saying, bring out the men who have come to you, who have entered your house, for they have come to search out the country. And so she took the men in. She hid them under some flax. She hid them under some straw type things. And she told the people, the men aren't here. But then she told the men, listen, this king is scared to death of your God. And these people are scared to death of your God. The reason is because they have heard of the mighty works that God has done. Now think about that. In fact, go back to Deuteronomy chapter 34 a moment and look at what it says in verse 11. And all the signs and wonders which the Lord sent him to do in the land of Egypt, before Pharaoh, all his servants, and in all his land, by all the mighty power and all the great terror which Moses performed in the sight of all Israel. What are all those mighty works? Those plagues back in Egypt, the death of Pharaoh in the sea, how God has provided for his children. All that God has done is now spread. And the people here in Canaan have heard about it, and they are scared to death of their God. And so the king of Jericho says, listen, you go find those guys. And Rahab says, no, they're not here. Sorry. You're going to look somewhere else. They're not here. And then she asked these men, listen, when you come, will you have mercy on my family? Will you please protect us? And they said, yes, we will. But you're going to have a red cord hanging out the window when we come, so we know who this is. And when they came to Jericho, Rahab and her family were spared. I find it interesting. Why did God choose Rahab? I mean, she wasn't exactly a nice lady, we would say. Not that she was mean, but the way that she behaved was not the way God wanted people to behave. I think God choosing Rahab tells us that regardless of how bad we are, regardless of how far we've fallen, God always wants us. God chooses the most uncommon people. In fact, when you go to Hebrews chapter 11, Rahab's name is there. Isn't that interesting? Along with Abraham, along with Moses, Rahab's name is there. Why? Because by faith, she hid these men. And when they then began their assault on Jericho, she was delivered. But that's not the end of Rahab. It's not that here's someone that would be outside, that is uncommon, that God would call in. We'd think, well, what we'd do is we'd go find the president of the country and we'd let him come in. No, here's the most unusual person that God accepts. And what's more interesting about that is she was taken into the fold of the Israelites, and she became, as it were, one of them. But that's not the end. She married a man named Salmon, and they had a boy. His name was Boaz. He married a woman named Ruth, and they had a son named Obed. And Obed had a son named Jesse, and Jesse had a son named David. And Jesus is a descendant of Rahab. But isn't that what God's always done? Think about David in that smooth stone, an uncommon way. You think about Daniel in the land of Nebuchadnezzar. You think about his three friends that are there. God finds the most unique people to do things that he wants them to do. I think maybe because the proud and the mighty will listen to God. These are people who knew they needed God. And needing God, God wanted them. Isn't that powerful? I think what that says to us is, look, God's grace is so big and so wide. When we get older, if we do some really bad things, God still wants us. And that's so powerful for us. But now we come to Joshua chapter 3. Get your paper here. And I have my specialist draw Joshua chapter 3. And now Joshua chapter 3 comes, and they're fixing to start. We come to Joshua chapter 3, and now then they're fixing to start going into the land. However, before they crossed over, they're going to have some instruction. But notice what it says in verse 2. So it was after 3 days, the officer went through the camp. Wait a minute. We've been waiting for 40 years for this. And now you're going to make us wait 3 more days? We're ready to go. We're ready to go forward. Well, I guess if you've been waiting 40 years, 3 more days is not going to matter a whole lot, is it? But now God's going to give them some instruction about how they're going to go over. And what they're going to do is, as you read with me beginning in verse 4. Verse 3, it says, and when the command of the people, when the ark of the covenant of the Lord your God, the priests and Levites bearing it, then you shall set out from your place and go after it. Yet there shall be a space between you and it about 2,000 cubits by measure. Do not come near it, that you may know the way which you must go, for you have not passed this way before. So we're going to put here 2,000 cubits. There's our thought bubble right here. Our thought bubble, remember? And our instructions. Here they're going to have their instructions. So in Joshua chapter 3, they're going to have their instructions. I did some figuring on this. 2,000 cubits. I wonder if any of my young friends know what 2,000 cubits are. Well, I didn't. And so I had to figure, I had to go to Google. I had to go to Google to figure this out. 2,000 cubits is about 3,000 feet. And according to Google, that's half a mile. Well, then I tried to figure out, okay, I have a hard time figuring half a mile. So I tried to figure out how many city blocks are there in half a mile. And there are about 8 blocks in a half a mile. Then I got to thinking, okay, they're about 8 blocks behind. So in time, how much time is that behind the priests? He said, don't get too close. Don't get too close. Well, I did some looking on how many minutes it takes to walk a mile. And according to Google, between 17 to 20 minutes to walk a mile. Now, when me and Miss Jody walk, it's not 17 to 20 minutes. It's less than 15 minutes because Miss Jody walks and runs. She gets after it. But 17 to 20 minutes. So what that meant was, when they began, the priest had an 8 to 10 minute head start on them, and they had to stay 8 to 10 minutes behind. They had to stay 8 blocks behind. That's something. Go back just a moment to that 300 square miles. I did some figuring on that too. I tried to figure, okay, how big is 300 square miles? What can I give you that's equal to that? Well, I went to Google again. Do you know how many square miles the state of Texas is? 268,581. In other words, the promised land was bigger than the state of Texas, but it's more than that. If you put the state of Texas, the state of Maryland, and the state of Massachusetts, and the state of New Jersey together, now you've got about the size of the promised land. That's how big it was. But just think of how big Texas, look at your map of Texas, how big it is. The promised land is bigger than that. So they've been wandering this promised land for 40 years, bigger than the state of Texas. And now they come and they're about to go, and the priest is going to take off for the Ark of the Covenant, and they got to stay 8 blocks behind. They got to stay 8 to 10 minutes behind. Listen, they've been waiting 40 years to get there. Don't you think they'd be in a hurry? Don't you think they'd be excited to do that? But God's giving them instruction that he wants them to follow. And so what that tells us is that the children of Israel had to prepare themselves. Notice how they had to prepare themselves. Notice what he says in verse 5. And Joshua said to the people, sanctify yourselves, for tomorrow the Lord will do wonders among you. That word sanctify is a big word. I try to think, okay, what's the word sanctify mean? It means be dedicated. You have to be dedicated. You have to really mean it. You have to be serious about it. You be serious about that. You set yourself apart and you get yourself ready. And so they had to clean themselves up. They had to wash their clothes. They had to clean themselves. But it's not the outside God wanted clean. It was the inside. They had to prepare their hearts by preparing everything to go in. They couldn't go in dirty and filthy. They had to go in pure. God wanted them to go in, and then God tells them the order they're going to go and the tribes. I think something important is to point out God works today just as he did in the past. I think that's important for us to see. God is still working today for us, and God is still instructing us today. This book we call the Bible is God's instruction, God's mind to us, and he instructs us just like he instructed them. And don't you think that they stayed about 8 blocks behind? Well, then we come to chapter 4. Now then, when the priest puts his foot in the water, okay, we got the last column here, Joshua chapter 4. Here we got the Jordan River. Joshua chapter 4, we got the Jordan River. Do you see the priests there in the middle? The priests are going to put their foot in the middle. Put a peg there. We'll come back. When the priests went out and put their foot in the land in the middle, it was dry land. Well, the Jordan was flooding at this time. It wasn't just a trickle of water. It was a big flood at this time. And now they passed through on dry land. All these people, over 2 million people, over 2 million people. If you line up all the people in the city of Dallas, you line them up, you're going to have almost 2 million people. They're going to cross over. And the tribes are going to be in order that God wanted them to. But the priests had to touch their foot in the water. And when they did, and it wasn't just the priests, they carried the Ark of the Covenant. That was the presence of God with them there. And God said, what I want you to do is I want 12 men. I want you to choose one from each tribe. And I want that dude, when he goes over, I want him to pick up a stone out of this dry bed. And I want him to take it to the other side. And I want them to take those stones. Okay, here we got our stones here, right here. Back here. All right. See our stones? And what I want you to do, when they touch the river, I want you to go and I'll pick up those stones. I want you to carry them to the other side. And I want you to make a memorial there. Now, the other side is going to be Gilgal. And Gilgal is going to be the first place they're going to come. And God said, I want you to make a memorial. And the reason I want you to make a memorial, he says in Joshua chapter 4, is so that when your children ask what these stones mean, you can tell them what they mean. God intended this for a memorial. God intended for them to remember this. And he puts this memorial to help them remember what God has done for them in delivering them from the wilderness now into the promised land. And their children would come and say, "Hey, Dad, what do those stones mean?" Well, son, let me tell you. You see, one of the biggest advantages they had then was storytelling. They could sit down with their sons and say, "Son, let me tell you about your granddad. Let me tell you about your grandmother. Let me tell you what happened to them." And I was around 20 years old when that happened. For the last 40 years, we've been wondering, and now here you are, son. Here you are, grandson. And here these stones mean that God has given us this land he promised to our forefather Abraham. The kids were going to ask, what does this memorial mean? And not only that, all the world would ask. They're piling up these stones. They're putting these boulders there. And he's saying, I want you to build boulders of faith by this memorial. I want you to put it there for a memorial for these people, for your kids to learn and for the people to ask. God didn't intend for the story to stay just with Israel. He intended for the story to spread abroad. Well, we have other memorials, don't we? Remember that bow in the sky? We have a memorial today. It's called the Lord's Supper. We have the bread and the fruit of the vine. And maybe, just maybe, you've asked your parents, what does that mean? What does that mean every Sunday we partake of the bread and the fruit of the vine? What do they talk about Christ and his body? Why do they talk about his blood? What does that mean? And so, as parents, we use that as an opportunity to tell a story. And we tell a story about a young woman who had a baby. And he was special. And when he was born, there wasn't room in the inn. And he was all wrapped up nice and cuddly, and they put him in a small little feed trough. The shepherds came. They brought gifts. Angels rejoiced. And he was Jesus. And you know what Jesus did for us? You know the miracles Jesus did? You know the stories about Jesus? You know about his apostles that were with him? And they told his story. Now we get to tell his story. And that story isn't just for us. That story is for the whole world. We want the whole world to know about this. And so this memorial helps us talk about Jesus. Like those stones help them talk about what God had done for them. Get George a little book out and look at some takeaways in that book. I want to close with just a few. Let me start where I ended. Ask your parents the stories. Please tell me the story. Tell me the story about the plagues. Tell me the story about the wilderness wanderings. Tell me why that first generation turned back. Tell me the story about going into Jericho. Tell me about that Gilgal, that moment that they crossed that was going to be a memorial for them forever. Tell me the stories. Tell me your story, Mom and Dad. Mom and Dad, tell me your story. I want to know how you know Jesus. And then, let's go back to chapter 3. God gave us instruction for a reason. Because he wants us to know him and know how to please him. This isn't just a book of rules and laws. This is a book about how God loves us. And this story is a story of God fulfilling his promise to Abraham and giving them instructions about how they can fulfill that promise by going across the Jordan. And then, maybe it's you, maybe it's me, that somebody overlooks, pays no attention to, maybe thinks bad of, that God can use. that God can use like he did Rahab. And then back to Joshua. If you are the Joshua and your Moses has died, or if you are the Joshua and your Moses is still alive, don't be afraid to be Joshua. Be of good courage. I am with you. Isn't that a great story? I just love that story. I love how God takes Joshua, how he takes Rahab, how he has them go across, how they cross the river, how they make these stones, how the kids come ask this story. I like how even the bad people know the good things about God. They're fearful of God. I love that story. And I love how Moses prepared Joshua. I just love Moses. I love how God prepares us today. And you, my young friend, God is preparing too. Well, next week, Jordan will be back with you. And I know he'll do a good job. And I look forward to being with you in the week after that. And look forward to you joining Jordan on Sunday when he preaches. He'll do a fantastic job. Jordan always does. He always has something good for us. Always is so energetic for us and helps us love God and love God's word more. I just love to hear him teach a class like this, and I love to hear him preach. I can't wait to hear Jordan preach Sunday, and I can't wait for next Wednesday to hear him teach. Jody and I love you so much. Young and old, we love you so much. And if I could take my arms, just wrap around every one of you, please understand you are there in my hug, close to my heart. We love you, and we miss you so much. Stay healthy. Say your prayers tonight, and be good.